Good evening, everyone. Tim Addict. Good to see everyone back. Um, so we're on chapter 7, and if you've read chapter 7, you'll know that it covers a lot of different topics, a lot of disparate ideas and different aspects of AA. So it's difficult to summarize it. One simply has to go through the points that are in there, and I've isolated 23. I very much doubt we're going to get through 23 topics this evening, so it's possible that chapter 7 will spill over into next week. Now, the first point, which I've posted in the chat, is this: the solution to addiction and anonism is sponsoring others. The bit in bold is my caption, and then we have a little quotation. Practical experience shows that nothing will so much ensure immunity from drinking as intensive work with other alcoholics. It works when other activities fail. But if you are shaky, you had better work with another alcoholic instead. One wouldn't necessarily know from going to CA meetings or AA meetings. I think CA can be better about this than AA. You wouldn't necessarily know from going to AA meetings that the answer to addiction is working with others. You'll hear a little bit here and there, but often it's people talking about themselves and their feelings and their thoughts about their feelings and their lives, and that's all very good and necessary. But the first 11 steps are there to put me in a position where I can carry the message to others. In other words, be part of an endless chain of helping people find God, me having found God in the first place. God isn't hard to find, God isn't lost. As soon as one embarks on the process and tries to communicate with God, the experience is that God shows up. We go a little way of the way towards God, and God comes all of the way towards us. So really, from a very early stage in recovery, a person can help others at least start to remove the obstacles which enables the person to build a relationship with God. Now, this contains the fateful line: it works when other activities fail. There are going to be times when the first 11 steps don't seem to be cutting it, that one is distressed or distraught or despairing or disappointed, basically things beginning with D, which apparently is one of the worst letters of the alphabet. And the first 11 steps are doing nothing. You're just as miserable. And in fact, there are times when prayer and meditation make things considerably worse. There are times when you listen to spiritual talks or read spiritual books, but you're not really reading them. You're trying to think about your problems with which you're thoroughly obsessed through the lens of the book that you're reading or the talk you're listening to. And so all it's doing is amplifying the problem. And there's a writer called Elizabeth Berg that said that the rooms of psychotherapists would be emptied out if we reintroduced the chain gang. Now, it's a bit of hard work. Might do some people a little bit of good. Certainly, putting myself in a chain gang does me a lot of good. And the chain here is not the traditional form of chain gang, but we're forming a chain of communication. The next point: remember what you're dealing with. They're very ill. And there are several quotations. Some of these quotations, I've gathered them from throughout the chapter for clarity and to avoid repetition. Remember they are very ill. And then another one: they should be patient, realizing that they are dealing with a sick person. And then later on: he has been a very sick person. This keeps being repeated. Now, what this means is a lot of what people present when you're trying to help them, they can't help being that way. I couldn't help being the way I was. And one must never put down to resistance or unwillingness or messing around what could be simply explained by someone being very unwell. Now, there is such a thing as bad behaviour, and I behaved very badly when I was new in recovery, and I was reined in by people. They were very clear with me about what was inappropriate to share in meetings, what was inappropriate to do and say before and after meetings. We don't need safeguarding guidelines come up with the wise and benevolent omnicompetent conference, or let alone the General Service Board. We need a few grown-ups at the meeting that go up to people who are dicking around and saying, you want to cut that out, that's not helping, as was done with me. But when you're working with people, assume sincerity. Whatever is presenting, assume sincerity and try to help people get over that hump. I think I'm qualified to talk about sponsorship and 12 stepping into sponsorship, not because I'm good at it, but because I've been getting it very wrong for over 3 decades. So I know an awful lot about what doesn't work. You really mess up the first 200 or 300 people you sponsor. The next couple of hundred it's a bit like Russian roulette. Some of them get you on a good day, some of them get you on a bad day. You get past about 500, it starts to settle down a little bit and you get into a bit of a groove. So if you're in your first 10 or your first 20 or your first 100, don't worry, it's still early days. There's a lot to learn. If you're getting it wrong left, right and centre, that's fine. I'm going off topic slightly into the topic of sponsorship. Maureen quite rightly said, if they want to get well, you can't say anything wrong. If they don't want to get well, you can't say anything right. I think that's wonderful. And someone was told that they didn't have the right sponsor, and they retorted, yes, but I've got the right higher power. And sometimes you'll see the most extraordinary combinations. If there is sincerity on both sides, God seems to work through that and people get well. So you can't break the person. You might upset them, but they'll get over it. They've had worse. One aims not to upset people, but sometimes the job has to be done and the price is a little bit of upset. But anyway, this point about the illness, the sickness. You can miss a lot on the phone. It's helpful, particularly when people are new, to have them come to your home group. You see, when you see them physically, a good deal more of the vulnerability and the childlike nature, which doesn't come across on the phone as clearly and certainly doesn't come across in writing. Do nothing in writing if you can avoid it, because everything will be misunderstood and things will spiral out of control. So there are other ideas which run through chapters 7, 8, 9 and 11, where it's helpful as a reader of the book to pull out these principles which can be deployed as general principles and say, I'm going to do this in every part of my life. And the next one, which is in a particular context, cooperate, never criticise, to be helpful is our only aim. I think I could hazard a guess and say 98% of my problems in interactions with other people have come from acting outside this line, being uncooperative, being critical, and having aims other than being helpful, i.e. having my own desires, plans, sensitivities. The program is terribly simple, but it does need to be practiced. The next bit, the initial stages of step 12, must be tailored to the person. I spoke to someone who's fairly new at a meeting the other day. I'm not going to read the whole quotation out, I'm just going to talk about it. You can look at the quotation if you like and maybe listen to the recording and then read the quotations. You have to find out about them. You have to find out where they're at, what their experience is, how long they've been in, what experience they've had of recovery before. Listen out for the evasive answers. Listen out for the answers which do not answer the question you've just asked, because you know that's where the gold lies. You let them do about 3/4 of the talking and don't immediately start talking about the solution. they're going to struggle to identify. So one has to let them go first and then match their stories with your own. One often sees this with a newcomer at fellowship after the meeting, that everyone's so keen to carry the message, they don't care to stop for a moment and actually listen to the person. And I've seen this go so spectacularly wrong that people start to go in quite aggressively if they detect any form of resistance or half-heartedness or indecision or uncertainty on the part of the person. They start to throw threats of dying of alcoholism at them, or lay jargon on them which they won't understand because they haven't read the book. Sometimes at fellowship, my job has been to try to short circuit the do-gooders next to me, and because I've noticed that the little newcomer, the shutter has come down, they're not listening, they're getting angry, and they're about to leave the table. And so you've got to find a way of pouring oil on the troubled waters, reassuring them, giving a little slap to the person next to you that's going in too hard, and starting to form a relationship with them. And once there was a chap a few years ago, it was after the Hoxton meeting on a Friday evening, I remember it clear as day. There were 2 or 3 people going in like a sort of Gestapo tag team. And we were losing the chap. You know, in those medical dramas when they're losing the patient. And I asked him about something. He used a phrase, and I started to ask him about English literature and something I know about. And we had a talk, and after about 20 minutes of him and me talking about English literature, I could start popping other ideas into the sentence. I needed to establish a rapport first of all. That's what comes first. And not to talk about the solution until they're actively asking for it. So find out as much as you can. The next one, there are lots of quotations in the chapter about timing, waiting for the point at which the person is thoroughly depressed, thoroughly miserable, nothing left in the tank. And the tagline for this one is don't pick unripe fruit. If you try to carry the message to someone that isn't having it, stop, because all you're going to do is poison them against AA. And I've often had this with sponsees where they want to argue with something. I said, well, let's talk about this another time. Why don't you give me a call when you've got over your objections, you've got over your difficulties, and you're ready to just listen? And you have to sometimes leave it weeks, sometimes months. And then they call and the tone is different because they've got to a rock bottom and the fight has gone out of them. And then they're ready to receive something. Now, the absolute disaster in that situation is to run after them like a little hedgehog and send them a little message to see how they are. You'll set them right back at the beginning of the process. They'll have to start again in getting to their rock bottom. So you leave them alone. If they're not interested, you leave them alone. And that's very much the next one. Only depressed and hopeless people will listen. That's why I listened, is because I tell you why I listened. I was let go of by everyone before I got to AA. And then in AA, I was let go of by almost everyone because I was a real nuisance. And once you've been left on your own in AA because no one will talk to you because you're a terrible nuisance, then you're depressed and then you'll listen. One mustn't get in the way of that. To go back to the previous one, there's a quotation about him not being interested in your solution, or someone who says he cannot or will not work with you. Sometimes with sponsees, there's a sort of battle of wills as to who's in charge here. It's part of the process. It's a very curious thing. Quite often, I will give people who are very difficult and having a hard time, a single thing to do every day. For instance, come to the morning meeting, be there by 7 o'clock. If you can do that for a week, once you've got the hang of getting up, then we'll move on to getting up and reading the book. Then we'll move on to getting up, reading the book, saying a prayer. But there's no point in trying to run before you can walk. Let's do one thing. Just one. Do it for a week. And once you've done that for a week, we'll speak and then we'll start to do another thing as well. And this determines who's in charge of the process. Now, one's not in charge as the sponsor because one is better or superior, but the whole premise of the relationship is you have something that they don't have, which is sobriety, and hopefully a slightly more orderly life than they do, and you've got a system which works. And someone around here used to say very simply, if you want what we've got, you do what we did. And so anyone that's trying to argue or negotiate, forget it. And the negotiation is this whole question of who's in charge here is fascinating, because sometimes you'll get this. I perhaps shouldn't say this, but you do get this more in Al-Anon. With prospective Al-Anon sponsees, there's a real sort of battle of wills as to whether you, the sponsor, are being hired like a tradesman to do a particular job round the spiritual house of the person asking to be sponsored, or whether they genuinely want something you offer. So I've found sometimes I'm being audited. You know, in Star Trek, they have the Borg, and the Borg do the Borg scan. The little light goes up and down to detect everything that's there. And I felt a Borg scan taking place. People get very picky. Well, exactly how do you take someone through step 11? And all sorts of other questions. And but one of the interesting things, recently someone asked me potentially for sponsorship. And I said, great, if you're interested in sponsorship, I'll send you some questions because I just want to get a few things clear and out of the way first because I'm not suitable for everyone. And they said, well, I think it would be better. It's better to communicate over the phone. So I'll just give you a call in a couple of days. I thought, now, this person is right in a sense. Of course you communicate better over the phone. But I've seen this play before. And this play is, who's in charge? Am I supposed to fit round them or are they going to fit round me? And I looped back and said, if you're interested in sponsorship, let me know and I'll send you the questions. And you stick to that. If you lose at that point, if you give in at that point, then it talks in the chapter later on. Don't put your work on the service plane. In other words, you're not the service provider to them. Particularly these days, a lot of people have gone through the social services system, which is I have no opinion on. But people are referred to as clients, and the service providers provide services to the clients. And they've had that dynamic a dozen times. And then they come into AA and they think that the people who are there are the service providers, and we're not. We're doing something entirely different. We're leaving out a set of tools for them to pick up if they're interested, and we'll encourage them and help them along the way. But I'm not the service provider. And I remember I used to travel halfway to meet sponsees. Wherever they were geographically, they'd travel halfway or at least some of the way. And what I found was that the ones who came all the way to see me every time were more responsive with the step work than the ones where I went to near where they were. And it's all about the nature of the relationship, who's in charge, who's doing what for whom here. So that must be made very clear to start with. Now, not rudely, and it's, as I say, it's not a matter of being above, but I'm very clear about what I'm doing as a sponsor. I'll say to people, I'm not here to be a chum. What I'm here to do is to explain what the book says, share a little bit of my own experience, show you how to work the program, show you how to apply it to situations until you can do that yourself. And your job will be, when I present you with material, your job will be to take notes so that I don't have to present it twice. If you have any questions, let me know. It's not friendship. I may have told this story before, but Brian, my sponsor many years ago, I phoned him up once, and I was sober years. I phoned him up and said, could we meet just for a coffee? And he said, you know we're not friends, don't you? Which sent shivers down my spine. And the people in my first year who were most helpful didn't come and find me in my little hovel. They said, we're over here, come and join us. I'm at this meeting. If you want to see me in person, that's where I'll be. Come and join me. So you set this out very clearly at the beginning so that they have to make the effort, the demonstration that they are genuinely interested in what you're offering and aren't there to have an argument. The next principle, leave them alone, let them come to you. One of the most common questions I've had from sponsees, they'll say, my sponsee has disappeared. I haven't heard from them. Shall I call to see they're okay? Shall I just a little text message, a tiny little text message? And of course, they'll feel as soon as you do that, that text message is like a heat-seeking Scud missile going all the way from Iraq to Israel and finding them in their little flat in Tel Aviv. And they feel hunted down. You think it's a little text message. They feel hunted down. They've hidden all the way down their little burrow, like in Watership Down, right at the end of the little tunnel. And this little message goes, hello? Haven't you done your step work? Because that's what it means. Now, I'm going to break something to you. If a sponsee isn't calling you, they don't want to hear from you. They do not want to talk to you. Why are you just leave them be. Go and find someone else to work with. Do something else. So there's a lot in the chapter about leaving them be. The next point I'm going to skip over, conviction through identification, is a very simple idea, as I spoke about earlier, is you get them to talk about their drinking history and then you match them with experiences of your own. What you don't do, I will talk about this a little bit actually, what you don't do, and I've heard people do this and it doesn't help, is I think women don't do this as much. This is something that I've seen men do a lot more often, trying to show off to the newcomer about quite how grotesque their drinking was and all of the eye-watering things they did when they were drunk, not realising that the eye-watering things they did when they were drunk were actually because they were eye-watering people, not because they were drunk. Because people will often say in meetings, oh, I did this and I did that and it's disgusting things. They say, well, that's my alcoholism. And I think, ooh, maybe, but maybe that's your character. With newcomers, you've got to find out exactly what their drinking was like. A lot of people have got a so-called high rock bottom in that they haven't had lots of the particular external consequences. And there are lots of people, I knew a chap in London, I won't say his name, who his step 8 was very, very thin because all the way through his drinking, although he got very drunk and was very dependent on alcohol, his level of morality actually remained very, very high. And it was because of a fairly minor thing he did in his drinking, which breached his moral code, which got him to call AA. And he's a genuine alcoholic, had it bad, but his moral compass was entirely intact. So you don't want to go in, for instance, with someone like that with very, very lurid stories because you're just going to put people off. You've got to find out where they are and then match their stories with stories of your own which are on the same level. Once they've been to meetings, they'll start to be able to identify by analogy with people whose stories are very different. But I tell you, there are lots of different types of drinkers, and I did not identify with a lot of drinkers in meetings. Definitely alcoholic, but I drank the way uh, drug addict friends of mine took drugs. Much more hell for leather, wanting to check out rather than joining in. And that this is one of the reasons why I enjoyed NA meetings when I was new, and later on I enjoyed CA meetings and DAA meetings as well, because the substance was different often, but the thinking was the same. So when you're 12th stepping someone, you want to bring them on board by matching. And also, and this is an important thing, talk about the solution only once they're sold on the problem. Before I'm willing to listen to a solution, I have to know I've got a problem and know I'm completely out of ideas. There's a very famous Bill C line about where he goes to his sponsor and he presents a situation and the sponsor says, you'll have to go to God. And Bill says, can't you give me something more concrete than that? And the sponsor says, for you in this situation, there is nothing else. Go to God. Now, one will only actually do that. One will only go into the next room, get on one's knees and start praying and stay there until you hear the voice of God, when literally everything else has been tried, when you've got a problem you can't solve and you're out of a solution. Because it's an extreme solution that we offer, and it also attacks the ego, which is the source of all the problem in the first place. It comes with a self-defense mechanism. It's fascinating. In Bill's story, when Ebby is 12th stepping Bill and talking about God, Bill is overwhelmed with these childhood memories about religion. And what he recalls specifically is the rebelliousness against it. It was the church on the hill over there, and his grandfather talking about how there really were the spheres and their music, but he wasn't going to let anyone tell him what to believe or what to do. So this is the ego's resistance against God. In fact, the ego can't be convinced. There's something in one of Bill W.'s essays on emotional sobriety, which is a good essay, but what he does, he rediscovers the program that he wrote down in 1939 as though it's something new, and of course it's not. He's just forgotten about it. As when he was in that terrible depression, his friends in AA said, Bill, instead of writing about the steps, why don't you take them? But in that essay, he says, how are we going to convince our Mr. Hyde, which is his synonym for the ego, how are we going to convince Mr. Hyde that he's wrong? How are we going to convince the ego that it's wrong? Bill, you can't, because the ego is rebellion against God. For the ego, God is the enemy. So you can't do anything about the ego other than detach from it. You can't get it to change its mind, and you can't tame it. But Bill's problem in Bill's story, which he sets forth, is that he doesn't mind the idea of there being a God, but he is bothered by the idea of a God that is personal to him, because a God that is personal to him, the Tsar of the heavens, as he put it, would represent a challenge to his supremacy as the highest authority in his own life. Whilst I'm still the highest authority in my own life, I'm not going to listen to a solution. Whilst I still think that the darkness within me has any reality at all, I'm going to be attached to it as my identity, and I won't be interested. I got to be so sick of it. I want to discover that everything I think and believe and feel is wrong. And then I might be ready. Next passage. So, and this is, I think, very interesting. Make it emphatic that he does not have to agree with your conception of God. He can choose any conception he likes, provided it makes sense to him. The main thing is that he be willing to believe in a power greater than himself and that he live by spiritual principles. Now, I'm a little bit hesitant to quote Henry Ford because of its somewhat questionable reputation, but apparently he said about cars, you can have any colour you like as long as it's black. And it's a bit like this with our wonderful clauses in AA about you can have any higher power you want as long as it makes sense to you. And a lot of things which are presented as higher powers, they might make sense in the abstract as a higher power, but what about this? You're going to pray to a higher power in step 7 to remove your character defects. Is your concept of a higher power able to remove your character defects? For instance, can my home group, Brick Lane, remove my character defects? Can trees remove my character defects? No, doesn't make sense to me. In that, if you can construe those as making sense to you, good luck to you. I don't want to stand in the way of that. But lots of those ways of getting round it are really an avoidance of the fundamental problem. Who's in charge, God or me? Who am I here for, me or God? Manis Friedman, the rabbi, says, when teenagers say, I didn't ask to be born, they're quite right. They've hit on the truth. We're not here for ourselves. If we think we're here for ourselves, we're going to go off on the wrong track. And also, it has to be a power and it has to be greater than us. And it's no good. I remember in early meetings, people were always saying, well, the ocean is a power greater than you. Yeah, but the ocean is not going to provide you with strength and direction. Certainly not direction. You might feel moral strength from the presence of the sea, but it's certainly not going to tell you how to deal with your meeting with Susan at 10 o'clock on a Friday morning. That's not going to come from the sea. So you can have any higher power you want as long as it makes sense. Makes sense in what way? In the context of what we're asked to do with that higher power. It has to be intelligent and have a communicative ability to make sense. Now, if you can't cope with that, fine. And Bill, his concerns about higher power aren't addressed. He just sets them aside with the notion he can have any concept he wants. And then he says as soon as he accepts the idea of a higher power, he's overcome with the presence of God, the awareness of the presence of God. So he didn't even get past his blocks. He opened his mind and the blocks were just pushed aside. But at this stage, at the point of discussion, there are some constraints. It's not an absolute free-for-all. Now, the next one is to scotch a particularly pernicious idea which runs around the programme. This is not a selfish programme. As it says in this chapter, to be vital, faith must be accompanied by self-sacrifice and unselfish constructive action. Suggest how important it is that he place the welfare of other people ahead of his own. So that's the end of the notion of the selfish programme. Now, of course, what people mean by the selfish programme is that one must, as it were, put one's own oxygen mask on first, get a few things sorted out before you run around saving the world. Fine. But why not say that? Co-opting the word selfish, which is about putting yourself in front of other people unreasonably and unfairly, is not a good way of conveying that idea. Weasel words. One thing that I've learnt in recovery is to say precisely what I mean, no more, no less. And that solves a lot of problems in relationships with other people. Next one. No special relationships, and sponsorship is paid on, not back. Make it plain he is under no obligation to you, that you hope only that he will try to help other alcoholics when he escapes his own difficulties. I only help people who will put themselves out to help someone else. Next one. There we go. So you'll be most successful with alcoholics if you do not exhibit any passion for crusade or reform. Simply lay out the kit of spiritual tools for his inspection. Show him how they worked with you. If a sponsee is enthusiastic about the program, I can match that enthusiasm with my own, but I absolutely mustn't be more excited about recovery for them, because all this will do is kick down the road the can of the person's lack of willingness. If the willingness does not come from horrific experiences of alcoholism or trying to battle alcoholism on one's own without a program, then no amount of chivying along is actually going to help them. Next one. Try again, try again, try again. Do not be discouraged if your prospect does not respond at once. Search out another alcoholic and try again. You are sure to find someone desperate enough to accept with eagerness what you offer. I think that's true in the romantic realm as much as the sponsorship realm. Just keep going. There's someone out there for everyone. But the point, sometimes someone gets their first sponsee and they think they're kind of set up for life now. And then, the sponsee never calls them again. They're back at square one. You've always got to be touting. And if I'm not spending hours a day sponsoring, I go to meetings to make up the slack. So there have been times when I've gone to 7 meetings a week, 10 meetings a week, because I don't have any sponsees or many sponsees, and always on the lookout. And you never need to worry about numbers. Your increasing efficiency will handle that. I've seen people come very unstuck in recovery by capping the number of sponsees they think they can handle. Because what it's doing, imagine a cistern with a pipe coming down from the cistern and a tap at the bottom. The reason water is flowing from the water tank, the cistern, through the pipe, through the tap, is because the tap is turned on at the bottom. If you turn off the tap at the bottom, the water can no longer flow from the top, and the water in the pipe becomes stagnant. So I've always got to be in a position where I'm, as it says in a later chapter, giving away the whole product. Absolutely no holds barred. Now, the more sponsees one gets, the more one has to smarten up the way in which one's sponsoring people, and also sometimes over time you're going to start to redirect people to other people in the home group who have fewer sponsees, who are in a better position, particularly to handle newcomers that are going to need a load of time. So I don't just take people on because I'm asked. My job is to help them get the best possible sponsor for their position. That might be me, it might not, and that helps handle the numbers as well. So what is sponsorship? It says here, he is prepared to go through with the 12 steps of the program of recovery. Having had the experience yourself, you can give him much practical advice. Sometimes it's said in AA, we don't give people advice. Of course we do. In fact, the advice not to give people advice is advice. So that cuts off the branch it's sitting on, that little particular dictum. Of course we give people advice, but it's on the level of this. This is what I think is going on in this situation. This is what I suggest you do. This is what I did in a similar situation and it worked. But the choice is yours. But because the person must always be under the understanding that they bear final responsibility for the consequences of the decisions they make. This is why there are no edicts to sponsees about do this or do that, because if something goes wrong, particularly if it's outside the scope of the 12 steps, if you tell them to do something and they do it and it's a disaster and it was against their conscience, that's your fault now. And I've seen the most awful situations. Doesn't happen very often. In fact, there are only a couple I can think of where really bad advice was given. Advice was given to a chap in Slough who was in a very entangled relationship to drop the girl he'd been in a relationship with, and not say why, not give any indication. And there had been suicide attempts. There'd been an institutionalization, and the torture it put the girl and her family through by, I think it's called ghosting, just disappearing off the face of the planet, as opposed to writing a good letter to explain, look, I'm in trouble, I'm going to seek some help, I'm being looked after, there's nothing to worry about, I'm fine, to just put their minds at rest. And he just blindly followed that. Well, I say blindly, he knew at the time it was a bad idea, but he did it. And the number of people that affected, it was remedied. So one's got to be a bit careful with advice outside the scope of go to this meeting, do this step, particularly with family. One of the great traps with sponsoring people and giving advice is sponsees you actually quite like the company of. If they're really annoying and you're desperate to get off the phone, you're probably going to give really good advice because you're not personally engaged. If you like the person, the danger is that you'll side with them in their presentation of a situation that they're in, and your critical faculties will be turned off. And especially on the Al-Anon side, you'll weaponize them against their own family when actually they're the schmuck, and they've been selling you a bill of goods about what's really been going on. So one's got to be incredibly skeptical and maintain that skepticism, even with sponsees you really get on with and you really like and you feel very much at one with. Maureen said they never tell you more than 65% of the truth. And I think that's about right. So keep your critical faculties, make sure that they are responsible for their decisions, and the best advice is to stick to principles and say how you apply that principle, up to you. I'm not going to tell you how to apply it, but here's a story. Tell them a story so that they have to do the work of working out how to apply it. The one thing where you can give very specific advice is if they're writing letters. If you read the letter, you can retrieve and eliminate from it anything which is likely to upset or cause further trouble. So reining people back from saying things which are going to damage or upset or aggravate the people around them, I think that's the sort of advice which is worth its weight in gold. So scanning outgoing communications has saved a lot of relationships in AA, in my experience, and me and people around me. And I've often laughed with friends about the first drafts of amends letters they were about to send versus the last draft. There was someone once that at the end of an amend letter wrote, I know that my behaviour really affected you, but boy, I've learned so much from this experience of steps 8 and 9. It's an ill wind that blows no one any good. And can you imagine how that would have gone down? Fortunately, they were held back from saying that. Or the other thing, you see, step 8 and 9 is exactly where this comes in. When someone wants to say, I'm sorry if you feel that I might have harmed you, rather than I acted like a schmuck and I shouldn't have done it, if you feel like I might have harmed you. So that's where the advice comes in. It's reining people in, not getting them to actively do things. If they want something other than sponsorship, jog on. Now, there are quite a few passages in the chapter on that topic, and it talks about shelter and money and connections and those things, and I find that very rare. It does happen that people want those things, but what people often want is chummy chum. They want to be your little chum, as though they've decided you're going to be their new best friend. And it's like, if anyone remembers those cartoons from the 1950s with this huge abominable snowman and Daffy Duck, and the abominable snowman grabs Daffy Duck and sort of treats him like this tiny little soft toy. I'm going to love him and da da da. And sometimes you can feel people doing that with you, and you're like, let's not do this particular dance. Let's just do some sponsorship here. I'm not there to be chummy. And that attempt to establish a relationship of parity, we're on the same level but we're at different stages of the journey. The information is going in one direction. It's very interesting. When I was new, I knew instinctively when I called Maureen or Doug or Sue not to ask them how they were and expect them to narrate their day. We weren't taking turns. They were there answering the phone, and they'd said, "What can I do for you?" And it's very interesting. Sometimes people do it as a reflex, but I say, "Right, how are you?" And say, "I'm very well. How are you?" No. You don't do that with your gynecologist. You don't do that with your tax advisor. You don't do... It's not a relationship quite of equals. You're equal in value in God's eyes. You're equal as alcoholics. You're equal as members of AA. But in this relationship, there's a little bit of an imbalance there, and people try to get round that. And if you offer friendship in the real narrow sense of friendship, then it mucks up the sponsorship, because then you're frightened of saying what you need to say, because often you need to say some very tough things. One needs to be very careful. The Bill does say offer them friendship and fellowship. But if you read Bill's writings generally, he'll refer to almost complete strangers as his friends. My new friends, people he's known 8 minutes. He just means by friends, people you're on good terms with. He means cordiality. It doesn't mean friendship in terms of best buds. Now, the book talks about helping people materially. I don't. There are agencies that do that. We have a welfare state. It's a different country we live in than America in the 1930s. The next principle, and there is lots of stuff on this in this chapter: God first, everything else second. We simply do not stop drinking so long as we place dependence upon other people ahead of dependence on God. And that includes, obviously, dependence on a sponsor. The dependence on God must come first, which means the first thing in the morning, the last thing at night, I'm connecting with God. When I'm between tasks, I'm connecting with God. The sponsor, when one's going through a process with a sponsor, is there at certain points of the journey. But one must not become the authority in their life. The authority is God. It's not you. Now, sometimes people have trouble with relationships, and I've heard there's an occupation called relationship counsellor. If I was a relationship counsellor, the sessions would last 8 minutes, and that would be the end of it. There wouldn't need to be a second session, because I found this passage to be the entire formula. Though his family be at fault in many respects, he should not be concerned about that. He should concentrate on his own spiritual demonstration. Argument and fault-finding are to be avoided like the plague. And then it talks about that the alcoholic must continue to demonstrate that he can be sober, considerate, and helpful, regardless of what anyone says or does. Now, adopting this in the home, in the workplace, in the home group, no argument, no fault finding, sober, considerate, and helpful. It's hard to think of a dispute one has with someone else that wouldn't be short-circuited by those 5 principles: no argument, no fault finding, sober in temperament as well as physical sobriety, considerate and helpful. The formula for getting on with people is not complicated. I mentioned this before about argument. I asked Jonathan why other couples seem to argue and we don't. He said, because we don't like it. We've made the decision at some level. We're not going to argue, so we don't. Next little bit. And my tagline for this one is, self-reliance is dumb, God-reliance is smart. When we look back, we realise that the things which came to us when we put ourselves in God's hands were better than anything we could have planned. Follow the dictates of a higher power. Dictates, you have no choice about the matter. Follow the dictates of a higher power, and you'll presently, in the short future, or literally right now, you will in the present live in a new and wonderful world, no matter what your present circumstances. In other words, my experience of life has got nothing to do with my circumstances. But here's the thing. I don't plan or make decisions because I know that if I simply put myself in God's hands, that will be better than anything I could decide. Someone asked today, they phoned me up and said, how much effort do you need to put into working out what to do with your life and making big strategic decisions about career? And I said, I don't. All I do in the morning is say to God, what do you want me to do today? If I were to change my career, that would not be a single decision. It would be 1,000 decisions in a chain, each of which is taking place on a specific day, involving specific actions on specific days. So I don't need to figure anything out. I don't need to figure where my life is going, anything about the future. Asking God what to do today is the entire formula. So I said to this person, all you need to do is ask God every day what to do. She said, is that it? I said, that's it. She said, that was quick, wasn't it? I said, yes. I think it really is as simple as that. And I think we will go through to the end of the chapter. It's only 2 or 3 more little odds and ends. So there's a bit towards the end of the chapter which can be summarised as this. You can't avoid drink, so don't, but don't tempt fate. So in early days, to avoid drinking situations, if you find yourself in one, so be it. So I had to work. I did a bit of silver service waitering when I was new, and I had to serve alcohol. There you go, it was my job, I had to do it. It is my experience, though, that I was tempted to want to go to places where there was drinking, there was drug taking, there were other activities, and that did me no good whatsoever. Very straightforward. Don't tempt fate. The guiding principle of the big book, it's actually stated to be the guiding principle elsewhere, but it comes in here. Do not think of what you will get out of the occasion, think of what you can bring to it. If it is a happy occasion, try to increase the pleasure of those there. If it is a business occasion, go and attend to your business enthusiastically. So when I'm at fellowship after the meeting, I'm not there for social purposes per se, I'm not there for my own social purposes. I'm there to be part of the group of people who happen to be at the table. To do fellowship after the meeting is a surprisingly difficult thing. People think all you have to do is go along, order your food, sit down and just wait to see what happens. But bringing God into it, you're constantly saying, am I helping make sure that everyone at the table is getting a chance to be involved in the conversation? Is anyone getting frozen out by individuals hogging the table? Is anyone getting frozen out by conversations which not everyone can take part in? Are the newcomers who are simply not understanding the jargon? Is everyone getting a fair share of producing topics for conversation? It's a real skill. If you watch Downton Abbey, if you watch other things about banquets 100 years ago, there's a whole etiquette, and the etiquette was there to ensure that things worked. And fellowship is like that. It doesn't just happen. Often there are people at the table who are really paying attention, who are FHB family hold back to try to make sure that everyone at the table is looked after. One of the great crimes at fellowship is where two people get into a little huddle because they're doing the getting to know you, getting to know all about you, and you want to get a room or do this somewhere else because the two are turned towards each other, and so the people are frozen out on either side, and the two people opposite them are on the edge of a conversation far off to the right and a conversation far off to the left. This is why the traditional thing was you talk to the person on your left for the starter, and as soon as the main course comes, you turn to the person on your right and you talk diagonally. To bring this principle into fellowship completely changes fellowship. But this is the formula for how to get on in life, is not to be self-conscious, but to say, how can I make this more pleasant for everyone? Or how can we get the business done more effectively and efficiently? And the last one, before we get on to questions, leave everyone be, leave the world be. The quotation is, besides, we have stopped fighting anybody or anything we have to, which kills the opportunity to engage in much social media and certainly stops me from becoming a politician, which everyone is very grateful for. Now, we've got a question. Someone says, only working with sponsees that carry the message to others once he escapes his own difficulties. How is one to know this at the start? I tend to get annoyed when they get well and head off on their merry way. Quite right. The fact is, right from, and do keep the questions coming, right from day one, the individual can be given the opportunity to share. They can go to meetings and share. They can find newcomers and take them, even newer newcomers, and take them to meetings. They can find newcomers and say, let's read the book together. Let's just read a couple of pages every day together. Or let's read a little bit of the book before we get to the meeting. If they ask enough people, eventually someone will say yes. Everything that you're giving to them, they need to be passing on straight away, because it's only when you pass it on to other people that you understand whether you've understood it in the first place or not. And so you don't have to wait until the end of step 9. You've got to get people to be carrying the message and to make your conversations with them conditional on whether they're carrying the message to others. And one of the great traps is I get people coming to me sometimes for sponsorship who are 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30 years sober in considerable trouble. And they say things like, I want to have a new experience. And they've been through the steps a dozen times, but for whatever reason, there's some addiction which is still going on, some addictive pattern, or they haven't been doing many meetings, or they've dropped off the sponsorship, or they've gone to adult children alcoholics a little too often and it's rubbed off. They're in deep, deep trouble. And they say, I want a new experience. I want to do a deep dive. I want to go deeper. And under no circumstances are we going to do that. What we do is say to them, right, you need 2 new sponsees. You need to get over yourself, matey. Your darkness is made up. This pain is self-inflicted because you're enjoying it. Start working with others. Now, once you start doing that, and you might give them a basic toolbox of steps 10 and 11 to get through the day, but you don't go near any of the stuff. Maybe there are some behaviours which just need to be stopped straight away, not indulge, not investigate why I'm shouting at the dog. No, stop shouting at the dog first. Worry about why you're shouting at the dog afterwards. There's an awful lot of self-indulgence in recovery. Start with step 12 and then introduce steps 10, 11. When they're on an even keel, helping a whole load of people, there's enough sanity to be able to go through the steps and look at the more profound stuff going on. The other thing as well, and this is not really on the topic of the chapter, but it's related. I got a list, which is on the blog somewhere, which I've called low-hanging fruit. And I consider my life to have 8 areas. There is the mental, the physical, the practical, the social, the moral, the religious, the philosophical, and the spiritual. And it's a list of questions in each of those areas. Half a dozen to a dozen questions with really, really basic stuff like, do you have meals with other human beings several times a week? Do you eat with other people? Do you spend time in nature? How long do you spend talking to God every day? Questions like that, but in different sorts of areas. Do you write down everything you spend? Do you overdo sugar or caffeine? Do you have a regular time you go to bed and get up? Like real basic stuff. People think they've got deep, interesting psychological problems. They haven't. They've got half a dozen basic things which are out of control and which are very practical, just need to be brought back in control first. You get those basic things sorted out and lots of this complexity disappears. I'm very much a fan of Paul Martin, died with over 60 years, lived in Riverside, Chicago, wrote for the Grapevine a lot. And he talks about all of these special programs and advanced programs and special routes to spirituality and other practices. And he says the basic 12 steps, exactly as they're laid out in the book, again and again and again, will solve any problem. And the depression will vanish, the anxiety will vanish. Just not the case that a person is doing everything right but still feels terrible. Just not the case. I can only be upset if I believe my own upsetting thoughts, if I think they're real. Self-reliance is always at the core of it. So, right from the beginning, whatever state someone comes to me in, whether it's the new person who's like fresh, wet round the whiskers, gills, what are people wet, whatever, new people can be given ways to carry the message to other people. People who are desperately depressed and 20 years sober and full of these complex psychological problems from childhood, you can get them up and running in 2 weeks, carrying the message to others. I had someone come to me recently who was very depressed and been in recovery for years. And I gave him a few simple tools, and he was worried he was going to have to go and have some kind of deep psychotherapy or go onto medication or something. I gave him a few simple things to do. And by day 3, I said, "How are you doing?" He said, "I'm feeling a lot better." Just from 2 days of doing exactly what it says on 84 to 88, within 2 days, he had a valuable message for anyone in trouble in recovery. So they've got to be mirroring what you're doing right from day 1. Someone said, can step 12 be done without ever sponsoring others? No. But some people don't have the fortune or misfortune to be asked formally to be someone's sponsor. There are lots of reasons for that. And those can be good reasons. Men in their 20s just are not going to get asked very often. It takes a real while before you appear to others as knowing a damn thing. Even if you do, people will think you don't know anything. I've noticed female sponsees in their 20s get new sponsees very, very quickly. Men, it's very difficult. But they can have a gaggle of 15 people that they're talking to every day who are newer that they're helping. Often the most effective sponsor of the person is not their actual sponsor, but some other dude who they're talking to on a daily basis and just believing everything they're saying and doing everything they're suggesting. So step 12 is sponsorship. Where the rest of the program comes in, the practicing these principles in all our affairs, is field work to get the worked examples in order to demonstrate to people how to work the program. But the entire program is that middle thing of step 12, carry the message by explanation and narration of worked examples. That is it. There is nothing else on offer, but that will literally solve everything. With regards to getting sponsorship wrong, what would be some indicators or examples of getting sponsorship wrong? I mean, we could do 6 weeks on this. We're not going to. We could. I'll give you just off the top of my head some real indicators. If you're thinking about the sponsee when they're not in the room, something is going wrong unless you're doing a technical analysis of where you went wrong with someone else, preferably. If you're generally musing about your sponsees, generally ruminating about your sponsees, you've got sucked in. You're now involved, and as soon as you're involved, you're useless. You're not to be diving into the water to try to drag them to the shore. You're the one that is throwing. You stay safe on the shore with the life belt, and you throw the life belt in, which is attached to the cord. They grab the life belt and you gradually haul them in until they're at the ladder which can climb up. And they have to climb up the ladder. You don't climb down the ladder to help them out of the water. They're going to need to do that themselves. It's basically, the problem is getting involved. And one of the worst ways I can get involved is when someone comes to me with a number of years sober with an elaborate story of woe and how there's just deep pockets of unhappiness that no one has been able to reach, but they know you can reach them. Horseshit. Give them practical things to do. I don't believe in depth. All the stuff we write about in the steps is lying there on the surface. And if you went to your friends and relatives, they'd be able to write the inventory for you. It's not hidden. And every upset boils down to not wanting to have your own way. That's the end of it. Where I get it wrong is where I get involved. When I lost a sponsee at one point, I said to Doug, "What do I do?" He said, "Next." Go on to the next one. That is it. If you stay detached, you yourself have a sponsor, you go to the sponsor or other confidants, you go to the sponsor or confidants with the situation to use as worked examples to learn how to do it. You'll be fine. If you feel anything other than, mild pleasure or mild compassion when you're talking to a sponsee, if your body tenses up, if you get churned up, something is going wrong. You've got to find out why and stop that, because that's going to distort the relationship. It is, by the way, because you're being played, so you need to find out what the game is and learn how to short circuit the game, and you'll need a very experienced person to help you do that. What do you do with someone who keeps assuring you that they're ever so willing, but whose actions don't match their words? Willingness has got nothing to do with thought or feeling. It's got only to do with action. You measure willingness by action. I've got a number of sponsees at the moment, and a number of people are on a daily calling plan, and it's amazing. Every day the same person is getting through first because they're ready for when the phone goes on and they press the little button on the phone. That's what willingness looks like. It is action. It's indivisible. Willingness without action is fantasy. And also be very wary of people say, "Well, I can't do it because of this, I can't do it because of that." If they had an STD, they would be there at that clinic. They wouldn't be hanging around with excuses. And these are, people, I include myself in this. I would do anything to get drink and whatever substance I wanted, whatever person I wanted, because I had a tiny addiction to people and activities. Nothing would get in my way, and I was resourceful. in the A Course in Miracles, it says that unwillingness can be most effectively concealed behind a veil of circumstances which appear to be beyond your control. So it's just performance. If you're not performing, doesn't matter what reasons you think you're giving, they are not the reason. It is only ever lack of willingness. And lack of willingness is itself a function of not understanding addiction, its fatal, progressive, incurable nature, and the success of the solution. I told a CA sponsee to not cap the number of sponsees, and they stopped working with me. Their previous sponsor told them to only take one person through at a time. This seems pretty common at some meetings I attend. How should I handle this situation next time? Exactly the same way. There are exceptions. I know someone who lives in Portugal who gets someone to come and live with her for 5 days. She takes them through the steps up to the cusp of step 9, so they're ready to go out with the full list of step 8s ready to roll. She'll take them through the basics of steps 10 and 11, how to do step 12. There you do it one at a time. But otherwise, nah. The trouble is, if I'm spending, that 5-day thing works very well for some people. I hate it. I can't do it because of the way my life is structured. She's retired. It works very well. She's also Norwegian, which may help. Who knows whether that's a factor? But anyway, I don't do a sponsee any service if they have too much attention from me. People are sticky. The relationship gets too close. Any sponsee relationship which gets too close with people in their first few years, it always blows up. The people who I've fallen out the most with are the ones who are the closest to sponsees, which is why I don't get close anymore. Someone said, I like to think the sponsee must come to me. However, when I'm sponsoring single mums with a lot of children, is it reasonable to go to them, especially if they have a driving ban? When we try online, the kids are bouncing around all over the place in the background. The one area of latitude is when people have a number of dependents, and those dependents can be old people, those dependents can be young people, children. I do work around that, particularly the single parent thing is a particularly difficult situation. In the countryside, it's certainly different, as you say, because of the driving ban. You've got to adapt it to the situation. But it's very interesting. Yes, you're right there. There has to be some latitude, but it's not carte blanche. I had a sponsee for a number of years who had 9 children, and the husband went out to work, and she never missed a call. She sorted it out. So be a bit careful with that. Some latitude, but an awful lot can be concealed behind situations which appear to be outside someone's control. Is it advisable to call out sponsees that keep asking for concrete corrective measures, advice on whether concrete corrective measures or advice on whether amends need to be made, especially if they're indecisive between options? Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, people who keep asking for concrete corrective measures need to be taking better notes from previous conversations. There are lots of resources. What you do, if people are trying to outsource their step work to you, that's the first thing. So if someone wants me to give them concrete corrective measures, I'll say, go and read the 12 and 12 from beginning to end and find me 100 general identikit corrective measures that can be applied in your life generally. Whenever you have a problem, go down the list of 100 great ideas and see which apply, and then come to me, and then you can say, can I add to that? Does that seem reasonable? But I can't do the work for them. There are 100 other exercises you could give people. Go to 5 meetings, listen out, and come back with 25 corrective measures. Get 5 corrective measures from each meeting. That becomes your standard list of corrective measures. Pick from those for a year. You give people things to do to help themselves. You don't do the work for them. Now, this indecisiveness between options, I'm very skeptical about helping sponsees make decisions, because with any decision, you can argue one point of view or another point of view and make it sound plausible. What you can help people do is establish what principles to make decisions on, but say you're going to have to go to God and take responsibility for the outcome. I won't let decisions be outsourced to me. A couple more and then we're done. What are your views on sponsoring people of the opposite sex? There's that line that they say in San Francisco AA: the men sponsor the men, the women sponsor the women, and the gays sponsor everyone. And I think there's some truth to that. The thing is, now I'm going to be facetious. Not everyone likes humour these days, but frankly, these days there are so many sexes and genders and sexual orientations and fluidities and masculinities and all sorts of things flying around. If you try to construct a sort of paradigm, a template for the ideal sponsee where they're not going to fall foul of any gender or sex or sexual orientation difference, especially once fluidity is involved, I mean, how are you going to handle that? Basically, don't sponsor someone you fancy, and don't be sponsored by someone you fancy. If someone starts to get all starry-eyed, it's over. Just get someone else. We haven't got time for that. There is something about being sponsored by someone of the same sex from a psychological point of view. But a very close friend of mine says, when I was at primary school, the children around me would frequently say, I was in the West Country at primary school at any rate, and they say, "Oh, you girt woman," and very close friends say, "You're far more like all of my female friends that they were far more like women than most of my female friends," and I think there's some truth to that, which is why I've often got on very well with sponsors who are, in my early years, sponsors who are female. Absolutely perfect, because the mind worked in that sort of way. So you can't really do it. The problem is, don't sleep with your sponsees. You got that? Just don't do that. And if there's any sense that that's in the offing, kill it. The sponsorship, not the sponsee. Of course, it's one of those famous topics at Al-Anon meetings. Where would you hide the body? Okay. Someone said, the recommendation of Joyce Meyer last week was very helpful for me. Would you please give a couple of others? I just say Joyce Meyer again and Joyce Meyer again. There we go. I know of no other televangelists. But Earl Purdy, the Course in Miracles teacher, is ace. And that's it for the week. So that's it from me, Keith.